Tania, as we talked a little bit earlier about, since The Girl from Munich, you've published 4 more books and found an international audience. So I wanted to know, selfishly, what do you know about yourself as a writer now that you didn't know before your debut was published?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I think that now I'm a lot more confident. I think I'm a lot more confident in my writing ability, in the way that I write and the style that I'm writing in. This one was quite removed from my first 4 books in a different setting and a different time frame. So I wasn't sure how well it was going to be received, but I felt very reassured that people have accepted it really well, and that my writing style is good enough to keep going with. And maybe even I might even try some different time periods and different countries in the future. So I guess that's the main thing, that I feel a lot more confident now with the way that I write. Yeah,
that's brilliant. So I feel like we're not finished with Hannah. I feel like there's a lot more to learn. So are you planning a sequel to this book?
Yes, absolutely. Originally, this story was going to be far-reaching, so from the 1890s to the time that women get the vote. But there was so much to explore in the story that I couldn't fit it all in. So we made a decision to split the story in 2. So this is the first half, but each book is still standalone. Hannah's story picks up in about 1907. At the time of the suffragettes. They've risen to fame and fortune, and the Pankhursts are at the head of the societies, and they're fighting militant style for women's rights. So we follow that story through, and we hit World War One, and we look at the home front in World War One and what happens to women's rights and to women in general, what happens in their story, because men are all off to war. So much fascinating change that really catalyses in World War One, or in any war, I think, that leads to such incredible change. So that's really fascinating to look at as well. So we follow Hannah's story through the war until the women get the vote. Yeah.
Oh well, that's something really exciting to look forward to.
There's so many fascinating things. I can't wait.
I think we've probably reached a time where the audience could ask some questions. So has anybody got a question for Tania? No? Oh, sorry, there's one up there.
Yes, I'm really curious, how do you plot out your story?
Yeah, that's a good question. My stories always start with a family member that I'm intrigued by, because all of my stories are from family stories. So there's the person that's inspired the story, and then the story or situation around them. So I usually start with that and plot out a basic storyline, and then do lots of research to understand the world that they live in. And then there's lots of interesting things I pick up along the way during my research to really inform the story, and it helps take more of a path. And that's pretty well how I write. I probably do structure my my story up front as much as I can, so I know where I'm going in the story. But I must say that each day I sit down to write, I'm never quite sure where I'm going to end up that day. Research can really take the story in a different direction, or I might get stuck and not sure what I'm going to write about, and research inevitably will help me work out a way forward, perhaps not where I expect. And sometimes characters also just up and decide to do different stuff as well. That blows my mind still to this day, I have to say. Well, in this book, Hannah just decided to become a passionate naturalist, I suppose, and a collector of natural objects. So that kind of just arose out of the story, and that's quite a theme in the story by the end. Yeah, there you are.
Big Sandy, you had a question.
Given that your first 4 novels were based on your family history, or inspired by your family history, and this one you've gone into your husband's, were you nervous how that would be received by his family? Because, you know, our families have to love us, our in-laws don't.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I'm really fortunate. My father-in-law loves family history and his family stories, and he's always been a wonderful supporter of my writing. So he's been really, really supportive, which is wonderful. His cousin over in the UK, I've sent my previous books to them to show them how I've written before asking whether it would be okay to write essentially his grandmother's story. And they were okay. His wife read all my books. I don't think he did, because he's in his mid-80s now and they're a bit too girly for him. But I haven't sent them the finished copy of this yet, so we will see.
So how much license did you take? Like, how much is it based on the actual people, and how much is creative license?
Yeah, I didn't know a lot about Eleanor to start with. I think that was probably, you know, the bottom line. I knew when she lived, I knew where she lived, I knew how many children she had. Really only whatever you can find: births, deaths, marriages, and census records. They didn't have a lot of stories about her in her young years. My father-in-law's cousin had some stories about when she was an old lady, but nothing when she was young. So it pretty well had to come out of imagination and fiction. Yeah, so quite a bit of it is fictionalised.
Was there anything in your research that really surprised you?
That's a good question too. Yes, there was a lot of stuff actually that really surprised me. I learnt about bathing machines, for starters. They're wooden boxes that sit on the edge of the beach, where women go into in their street clothes, undress into their swimming costume in their bathers, and then they pulled out into the water either by hand or by horse, and then they emerge from the seaside door into the water so that no one could see them. So that was a really fascinating bit of Victoriana, and then they climb back in, of course, and get pulled back up. So I found that really interesting. And I also learned about the darker side of Victorian England, and the stories, the sensational newspaper stories about infanticide, and these serial murderers, these women who looked after babies in what we call now orphanages, or daycare centres, I suppose. They call them baby farms, and they would murder these babies after receiving money from the mother to adopt these children, and obviously, you know, the more babies they could get in, the more money they would accumulate. Mothers would never know the kids had been adopted out. So yeah, they were massive stories in the headlines in the newspapers at the time. So that was very, very, that was good, because it was good gritty detail that I needed to have for the story.
Another thing that I found really interesting, sorry Kira, was the anti-vaccination movement that you it's just like history repeating itself.
Yeah, that was really fascinating actually. Smallpox was a really big thing, and still lots of epidemics even in the 1890s. And there was a national vaccination program that was right through Britain. And you know, the rates of death were dropping most definitely with each successive epidemic, until the 1890s, when anti-vaccination movement really rose its head. People didn't understand why, you know, that vaccination wasn't healthy, that it came from an animal source and was inoculated that way. So there were all sorts of reasons why they didn't like it, and at the same time parents became quite complacent as well, so that they weren't vaccinating their children, and the rates of deaths rose, particularly in big cities like London. And so around that time they also discovered that they needed to give a booster basically after 10 years that the vaccination wasn't as effective. So that was something that happened in the 1890s as well. But yeah, the anti-vaccination movement, and yeah, it is really history repeating itself. But having said that also, I discovered that there was the first pandemic in 1889 of the Russian flu. So that was where it started in Russia, this flu pandemic. And it was global, went everywhere. And now with COVID-19, they've done plenty of research in the aftermath of that, historic research. And they think that some people are suggesting that there are actual quite convincing links between the pandemic of 1889 and COVID-19.
Wow.
So yeah, some really fascinating stuff, and also then all about the public health issues surrounding that, you know, how people prevented getting sick, the hygiene associated with that, and how people felt about it. It's very similar to today. Yeah. So that was really fascinating to explore as well.
I can only imagine. Kira, you had a question.
Well, I was going to say, hearing you speak, I think you're demonstrating why people read historical fiction, obviously, because there's all these exciting facts, but the passion that goes with it, you know, so bringing it to life. And I know years ago I went to an all-day symposium in honour of David Malouf, the great Australian writer, and he said, as a writer, unless he's learning or unless you're learning, your audience, your reader can't learn either.
Yeah.
And I wondered, because you're so passionate about what you're talking about, clearly a lot of this information must have been new to you, but you've got it down pat.
Yeah.
So would you agree with his statement that you...
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's almost one of my favourite parts, is whatever interesting information I learn along the way. I think, well, surely there's got to be other people who have never heard about this before that would be interested. And I love to share that information in my stories. And yeah, that's the other wonderful thing, is to bring people to life. Like historical, anything with history can be dry, and so if you try and bring to life these characters, these ancestors, I suppose, so that you can walk in their shoes and see through their eyes and see a different perspective and get a new understanding of how things might have been at the time. And I think that's great if you can bring those characters to life. You bring historical fiction to life and history as well, and that's something I'm pretty passionate about trying to do as well.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it is often the best way to learn about things we didn't know about. Yeah. Any other questions? I think we might call it a night. So thank you everyone for being here this evening. But stick around and get your book signed and have a chat, get some photos, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Do you want to smile for a photo?
Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you for coming. Really appreciate you coming out tonight.
Thank you everybody for coming in. Thank you, Claudine and Tania, for visiting us tonight. It was much appreciated.
Oh, thank you for hosting us
Wish you
this
every
evening.
success with your book. It's been
Thank you.
selling really well here, as you
Oh,
can see.
really?
I was
No,
saying last week,
amazing.
so it's been good.
Oh, thank you so much for having us, Jill.
Anytime.
Thank you.
For a pose.